What if the life you're living right now isn't actually yours? Henry David Thoreau believed most people spend their entire lives chasing things they don't need, following routines they never questioned, and calling it success. So he did something almost no one dares to do. He walked away from it all just to find out what really matters. And what he discovered might completely change how you see your own life. Henry David Thoreau was born in 1817 in Concord, Massachusetts, into a society that was beginning to move faster than it could fully understand itself. America was no longer just a new nation trying to establish independence. It was entering a phase of growth that emphasized industry, expansion, and productivity. Railroads were spreading, towns were becoming more connected, and the idea of progress was starting to dominate how people thought about the future. But with that progress came a subtle shift in how life was experienced. Time became more structured, work more demanding, and success more closely tied to material gain. It was a world that appeared to be advancing, yet for some, it felt like something essential was being left behind. He grew up in a modest household, not defined by wealth or status, but by a quiet emphasis on education and discipline. His family valued learning, and this environment allowed him to develop an early habit of observation. He was not simply absorbing the world around him. He was watching it carefully, noticing details, questioning patterns, and forming impressions that would later shape his thinking. There was a calmness in his early life, but also a sense that he did not entirely belong to the direction society was moving toward. When he entered Harvard College, he stepped into a more formal intellectual environment, one rooted in classical education, structured learning, and established ideas. He studied philosophy, literature, mathematics, and science, gaining access to a wide range of knowledge. But what is important about this period is not just what he learned, but how he responded to it. He did not treat education as a path to status or success. He treated it as a tool, something to engage with, question, and ultimately move beyond. Even at this stage, there was a quiet resistance in him, not a loud rebellion, but a consistent refusal to fully accept ideas simply because they were presented as authoritative. He respected knowledge, but he did not equate it with truth. This distinction would become central to his later work. After graduating, he returned to Concord, where he faced the same question that confronts many people at the beginning of adult life. What now? The expected path was clear. A stable profession, a defined role within society, a steady progression toward security. But for him, this path felt limited. He attempted to teach for a time, but quickly left when he was asked to enforce strict disciplinary methods that conflicted with his own sense of what education should be. This decision reflects something deeper than a simple disagreement. It shows his unwillingness to participate in systems that felt disconnected from genuine understanding. During this uncertain period, his relationship with Ralph Waldo Emerson became one of the most important influences on his life. Emerson was already an established thinker, known for challenging traditional views of religion and emphasizing the importance of individual intuition. Their connection provided him with both intellectual support and practical opportunity. He was introduced to a circle of thinkers who were exploring new ways of understanding the world, questioning established beliefs, and searching for something more direct and personal. Yet even within this environment, he did not become a follower. He listened, he engaged, but he maintained his independence. He was not interested in adopting ideas simply because they were new or appealing. He wanted to test them to see whether they could hold up not just in thought but in life. This desire to test ideas through experience is what led him toward the decision that would define his legacy. In 1845, he chose to step away from conventional society and live alone near Walden Pond. This decision is often misunderstood as an act of escape or isolation, but it was neither. He did not go into the woods to avoid life. He went to confront it more directly. His goal was simple in description, but profound in implication. He wanted to discover what is truly necessary for living, not what society says is necessary, not what tradition demands, but what remains when everything unnecessary is removed. He built a small cabin with his own hands. Using minimal resources, creating a space that was sufficient but not excessive. His daily life became structured around simplicity. He grew food, managed his basic needs, and spent long periods observing the natural world around him. But the significance of this experiment was not in the physical acts themselves. It was in the change they produced in his perception. Without the constant noise of society, without the pressure to conform or compete, he began to experience time differently. Days were no longer measured by productivity or obligation. They unfolded more slowly, allowing for attention, reflection, and awareness. He noticed details that are often ignored: the movement of water, the sound of wind, the subtle shifts in light throughout the day. These observations were not just about nature. They became a way of understanding existence itself. Nature, in his view, was not separate from human life. It was a reflection of a deeper order, something that operates independently of human systems, yet remains accessible to anyone willing to pay attention. Through this experience, he began to question the assumptions that define ordinary life. Why do people spend most of their time working to acquire things that do not actually improve their understanding or well-being? Why is success measured by accumulation rather than clarity? Why do people accept routines without questioning whether those routines serve any real purpose? His writing from this period captures these questions with a clarity that feels almost unsettling. He does not argue in a traditional philosophical way. He describes what he sees, what he experiences, and what he learns. This gives his work a sense of immediacy. It feels less like theory and more like observation. One of the most powerful ideas that emerges from this period is the notion that most people live what he described as a kind of quiet dissatisfaction. They're not necessarily unhappy in an obvious way, but they are not fully engaged with their own lives. They follow patterns, meet expectations, and pursue goals, but rarely stop to examine whether those goals are meaningful. At Walden, he attempted to break that pattern. By simplifying his life, he created space for something else, a deeper awareness of existence, a closer connection to his own thoughts, and a clearer sense of what truly matters. But what makes this experiment significant is that he did not present it as a universal solution. He did not argue that everyone should abandon society and live in isolation. Instead, he presented it as an example, a demonstration that life can be lived differently, that many of the constraints people accept are not as fixed as they appear. By the time he left Walden, he had not rejected society, but he had changed his relationship to it. He returned with a perspective that allowed him to see its structures more clearly, to engage with it without being fully absorbed by it. What began as a personal experiment had become something much larger. It was a challenge, not just to specific practices, but to the underlying assumptions that shape how people live, work, and think. When he returned from Walden, something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. He was no longer just someone who questioned society from a distance. He had tested an alternative, lived it, and come back with a clarity that made ordinary life appear different, almost exposed. The routines people followed, the goals they pursued, the structures they trusted, all of it now seemed less solid, less necessary than it once appeared. But instead of rejecting society entirely, he chose something more difficult. He remained within it, while refusing to fully belong to it. This created a kind of tension in his life. He was physically present in the same world as everyone else, but mentally, he stood at a distance, constantly observing, questioning, and resisting the pressure to conform. It was during this period that his thinking began to expand beyond personal living into broader questions about society, government, and moral responsibility. If individuals are capable of thinking for themselves, if they're not bound to follow systems blindly, then what happens when those systems become unjust? What is a person supposed to do when the structures around them demand participation in something they know is wrong? This question was not theoretical for him. It became real in a very direct way. At the time, the United States was involved in the Mexican-American War, and the institution of slavery continued to shape the moral landscape of the country. These were not distant issues. They were part of the reality he lived in, part of the system he was expected to support, whether actively or passively. He refused. When he was required to pay a poll tax, a small but symbolic act of support for a government he believed was acting unjustly, he chose not to pay it. This decision was simple on the surface, but its implications were significant. It was not about the amount of money. It was about participation. By paying the tax, he would be indirectly supporting actions he could not accept. As a result, he was arrested and spent a night in jail. This moment, though brief, became one of the most important turning points in his life. Not because of the punishment itself, but because of what it revealed. Sitting in that jail cell, he came to a realization that would shape one of his most influential ideas. The power of the state, the authority of institutions, all of it depends on the willingness of individuals to comply. If enough people refuse, not violently, but firmly and consciously, the structure begins to weaken. From this experience, he developed the idea that would later be known as civil disobedience. The principle is simple, but its impact is profound. When a law is unjust, a person should not simply follow it out of habit or fear. They have a responsibility to resist it, even if that resistance comes with consequences. What makes this idea powerful is that it shifts responsibility from the system to the individual. It is no longer enough to say that something is wrong. One must decide whether to participate in it. This creates a direct connection between belief and action, something that many people try to avoid. His writing on this subject does not present resistance as dramatic or heroic. It presents it as necessary, a natural extension of thinking for oneself. If a person truly understands that something is wrong, then continuing to support it, even indirectly, becomes a contradiction. This idea would go on to influence movements and leaders far beyond his own time, shaping approaches to resistance that rely not on force, but on refusal. But for him, it was not about influence or legacy. It was about consistency, living in a way that aligns with what one believes to be true. At the same time, his connection to nature remained central to his life and thought. Even after leaving Walden, he continued to spend large amounts of time observing the natural world. He walked extensively, often alone, using these walks as a form of reflection. For him, walking was not just physical movement. It was a way of thinking, a way of clearing the noise of society and returning to a more direct experience of life. Nature continued to serve as a kind of grounding force. While society was complex, often contradictory, nature remained consistent. It followed patterns that did not depend on human opinion or belief. This consistency provided a kind of clarity, a reminder that not everything is shaped by human systems. Through these experiences, his writing began to take on a more layered quality. It was no longer just about simplicity or self-reliance. It began to address the relationship between the individual and power, between personal integrity and social responsibility. He also became more aware of the difficulty of living according to these principles. It is one thing to step away from society for a period of time. It is another to remain within it while resisting its pressures. This requires constant attention, constant awareness, and a willingness to accept discomfort. He did not present this as easy. In fact, much of his writing suggests the opposite. To live authentically, to think independently, to act in alignment with one's beliefs, all of this comes with a cost. It can lead to isolation, misunderstanding, and conflict. But for him, that cost was preferable to living without awareness. By this stage of his life, he had become something more than a writer or observer. He had become an example, not in the sense of perfection, but in the sense of consistency. His life and his ideas were closely aligned, each reinforcing the other. What he offered was not a system to follow, but a challenge to examine the structures that shape one's life, to question whether they are necessary, and to decide, consciously, how to respond to them. As his life continued, the clarity he had gained did not settle into something simple or resolved. Instead, It deepened into a more complex understanding of what it actually means to live deliberately in a world that constantly pushes in the opposite direction. By this stage, his thinking was no longer just about stepping away or resisting specific systems. It had become a continuous practice, something that had to be maintained in everyday life, moment by moment. He began to see more clearly that the challenge is not only external. It is not just society, government, or tradition that shapes a person's life. It is also habit, the quiet, repetitive patterns that form over time, often without being noticed. These habits can pull a person back into the same kind of unexamined living he had tried to move beyond. This realization made his philosophy more demanding, because it meant that awareness is not something achieved once and then kept. It must be renewed constantly. His writing during this period reflects a deeper attention to detail, not just in nature, but in human behavior. He observed how easily people become absorbed in routine, how quickly they accept conditions without questioning them, and how rarely they pause long enough to examine the direction of their own lives. This was not presented as a criticism in a harsh sense. It was more like a quiet observation, something he had seen both in others and in himself. He also became increasingly aware of time, not as a measurement, but as an experience. Most people, in his view, treat time as something to be managed, divided, and used efficiently. But in doing so, they often lose the ability to actually experience it. Days pass, filled with activity, yet leave little impression. Life becomes something that happens in the background while attention is focused elsewhere. He approached time differently. For him, a single moment, if fully experienced, held more value than long periods of distracted activity. This is why his descriptions of nature often feel so detailed and deliberate. He was not simply observing the world. He was fully present within it, allowing even small changes to become meaningful. This attention to the present moment connects directly to his idea of living deliberately. To live deliberately is not just to make big decisions about how to structure one's life. It is to engage fully with each moment, to avoid drifting into patterns that are followed without awareness. This requires a level of focus that most people are not used to maintaining. At the same time, his thinking began to move more deeply into the relationship between the individual and society as a whole. He recognized that complete independence is not possible. People exist within systems, rely on others, and are shaped by their environment in ways that cannot be entirely removed. The question, then, is not how to escape society, but how to remain conscious within it. This awareness led him to a more nuanced understanding of resistance. Earlier, his act of refusing to pay the tax had demonstrated a clear form of opposition. But over time, he began to see that resistance is not always about direct confrontation. It can also take the form of quiet refusal, of choosing not to participate in unnecessary systems, of simplifying one's life in a way that reduces dependence on structures that do not align with one's values. This kind of resistance is less visible, but in some ways more difficult. It requires consistency rather than moments of action. It does not rely on recognition or approval. It is sustained by personal conviction, even when no one else is paying attention. His reflections on nature also continued to evolve. While earlier, nature had served as a space for clarity and connection, it now became something more integrated into his understanding of life itself. He no longer saw it as something separate that one visits or observes. It was something that one is always part of, whether recognized or not. He paid attention to cycles, growth, decay, repetition, and change, seeing in them patterns that mirrored human experience. Nothing in nature remains fixed. Everything moves, transforms, and eventually fades. This observation reinforced his sense that life should not be approached as something to control completely, but as something to engage with attentively while it unfolds. At the same time, he became more reflective about the limits of his own approach. Living simply, thinking independently, resisting unnecessary systems. All of this provided clarity, but it did not remove difficulty. Life remained uncertain. Questions remained unanswered. There was no final point where everything became fully understood. This awareness did not weaken his philosophy. It made it more grounded. It shifted it away from the idea of achieving a perfect way of living and toward the idea of continuous engagement. Living deliberately is not about reaching a final state. It is about maintaining awareness in the face of constant change. He also spent time studying and observing the natural environment with increasing detail, almost like a scientist. He recorded changes in seasons, plant growth, water levels, and animal behavior. These observations were not separate from his philosophy. They were part of it. They reflected his belief that understanding comes not only from thinking, but from direct engagement with the world. By this stage, his life had become a kind of integration of different roles. He was a writer, an observer, a thinker, and in some ways, an experimenter. But none of these roles stood alone. They were all connected by a single intention to understand life as it is, rather than as it is commonly assumed to be. What he offered through this integration was not a clear set of instructions, but a way of approaching existence. A way that values attention over distraction, awareness over habit, and understanding over assumption. And yet, even with all this clarity, there remains a tension at the center of his work. To live deliberately requires effort, but the world constantly pulls toward distraction. To think independently requires courage, but society rewards conformity. To simplify life requires letting go, but attachment is deeply rooted. He does not resolve this tension. He lives within it. And in doing so, he shows that the goal is not to eliminate struggle, but to remain aware of it, to engage with it consciously, and to avoid drifting into a life that is lived without ever being fully examined. As his life moved toward its later years, the intensity of his thinking did not fade, but became quieter, more grounded, and in some ways more deeply integrated into the way he experienced the world around him. He was no longer proving a point or testing an idea in the same deliberate way he had at Walden. Instead, what he had discovered there had become part of how he lived, not as an experiment, but as a steady orientation toward life itself. He continued to spend long periods walking through the landscapes around Concord, observing, recording, and reflecting. These walks were not casual or aimless. They were a continuation of the same attention he had cultivated earlier, a way of remaining connected to something that existed outside of human urgency. While society moved faster, becoming more focused on expansion, productivity, and progress, he remained attentive to slower rhythms. The movement of seasons, the patterns of growth and decay, the quiet changes that most people pass by without noticing. During this time, his role as an observer became even more refined. He kept detailed journals, documenting the natural world with a level of precision that bordered on scientific study. He tracked the flowering of plants, the freezing and thawing of water, the migration of birds. But these records were not simply data. They were expressions of a way of seeing, one that treats even the smallest details as meaningful. Through this continued attention, his understanding of nature deepened further. It was no longer just a source of clarity or reflection. It became something that revealed a kind of continuity, a sense that life moves through cycles that do not depend on human intention. Birth, growth, decay, and renewal. All of these occur without regard for human plans or expectations. This realization did not lead him to detach from life, but to accept its movement more fully. At the same time, he remained engaged with the social and moral issues of his time. His earlier ideas about resistance and individual responsibility did not disappear. If anything, they became more firmly rooted. He continued to oppose slavery and to support those who resisted it, not through dramatic gestures, but through consistent alignment with his beliefs. His life reflected a quiet form of integrity, one that did not seek attention, but did not compromise either. What becomes clear in this later stage is that his philosophy was never about escaping the world. It was about seeing it clearly and choosing how to live within it. The simplicity he advocated was not an end in itself. It was a means of removing distractions, of creating space for awareness. Once that awareness was established, the challenge was to maintain it, even as life continued to unfold with all its complexity. His health began to decline in his final years, and with that decline came a different kind of reflection. Illness introduces a reality that cannot be avoided or simplified. It places limits on action, on movement, on control. But even in this condition, there is no indication that he abandoned the perspective he had developed. If anything, it seems to have reinforced it. He faced his declining health with the same attention he had given to other aspects of life, not as something to be denied or resisted blindly, but as part of the natural process he had spent so much time observing. This does not mean he welcomed it, but he did not treat it as something separate from the rest of existence. It was part of the same continuity, the same movement of life that includes both growth and decline. He died in 1862 at the age of 44, leaving behind a body of work that does not present a closed system or a final set of answers. Instead, it offers something more subtle and, in many ways, more demanding. A shift in perspective, a way of seeing that changes how ordinary life is understood. What he leaves behind is not a philosophy that tells people exactly what to do. It does not prescribe a specific lifestyle or demand a complete withdrawal from society. Instead, it raises a series of questions that remain open. What is truly necessary? What is simply habit? What does it mean to live deliberately? And how much of life is being lived without awareness? His influence extends far beyond his own time, not because his ideas are easy to adopt, but because they're difficult to ignore once they are encountered. Writers, thinkers, and individuals searching for a different way of living continue to return to his work, not to find fixed answers, but to re-examine their own assumptions. In the end, his life does not resolve the tension between simplicity and complexity, between independence and society, between awareness and habit. Instead, it shows that this tension is unavoidable. The question is not how to eliminate it, but how to live within it consciously. And that is where the lasting power of his work remains, not in offering certainty, but in creating a level of awareness that makes unconscious living harder to accept, a quiet but persistent reminder that life is not just something that happens, but something that can be examined, shaped, and experienced with intention if one is willing to pay attention. Henry David Thoreau begins his philosophy with a simple but unsettling observation. Most people are not truly living their own lives. They follow routines, chase goals they never questioned, and measure success by standards they did not choose. They remain busy, but rarely stop to ask whether their way of living actually makes sense. This is where his thinking starts, not with abstract theory, but with everyday life. He looks at the way people work, earn money, build houses, and pursue comfort, and he notices something strange. In trying to make life easier, people often make it more complicated. They take on more responsibilities, more expenses, and more pressure until their lives become filled with obligations that leave little room for freedom. Instead of controlling their lives, they become controlled by them. Thoreau believes that this condition is so common that most people do not even recognize it. They accept it as normal. They believe that constant work, stress, and accumulation are necessary parts of life. But he challenges this assumption directly. He asks a basic question: how much does a person actually need to live well? This question becomes the starting point for his philosophy. Instead of assuming that more is better, he begins to reduce life to its essentials: food, shelter, clothing, and a small number of basic needs. Everything beyond that, he sees as optional and often unnecessary. By simplifying life, a person can regain something that is usually lost, which is time and attention. When life is not overloaded with unnecessary tasks and desires, there is space to think, to observe, and to experience the world more directly. This idea leads to one of his most important experiments. Thoreau decides not just to think about simplicity, but to live it. He moves to a small cabin near Walden Pond, where he spends time living with minimal possessions and focusing on basic needs. This experiment is not about escaping society completely. It is about understanding it more clearly by stepping outside of it. By removing himself from constant social pressure, he is able to observe both nature and human life with greater clarity. At Walden, he begins to notice something that is often overlooked. Life, when stripped down to its essentials, is not empty. It is full. The natural world provides constant movement, change, and detail. The passing of seasons, the growth of plants, the behavior of animals, all of these become meaningful when a person is fully present. This presence is important. Thoreau believes that many people live in a distracted state. Their minds are always focused on the next task, the next goal, or the next problem. Because of this, they miss the reality of the present moment. By simplifying life and reducing distraction, a person becomes more aware. They begin to notice things they would normally ignore. This awareness is not just about nature, but about their own thoughts and actions. Through this process, Thoreau begins to redefine what it means to live deliberately. To live deliberately is to make conscious choices rather than simply following habits or expectations. It means asking why something is being done and whether it is truly necessary. This idea connects directly to freedom. For Thoreau, freedom is not just about political rights or external conditions. It is about the ability to live according to one's own understanding. A person who is trapped in unnecessary work or constant desire is not fully free, even if they appear to have choices. By reducing dependence on material things, a person becomes less controlled by them. They gain the ability to choose how they spend their time and energy. At the same time, Thoreau does not reject work entirely. He recognizes that some level of effort is necessary, but he criticizes the way work often becomes excessive. People work far beyond what is needed, not for survival, but for status, comfort, or comparison with others. This creates a cycle where people work more to afford more, and then need to work even more to maintain it. Thoreau sees this as a trap. A person ends up spending most of their life maintaining a lifestyle that they never fully questioned. In contrast, he suggests that a simpler life requires less effort and provides more freedom. When needs are reduced, the amount of work required to meet those needs also decreases. This creates time for reflection, learning, and direct experience. Another key part of his philosophy is his relationship with nature. Thoreau does not see nature as something separate from human life. He sees it as essential to understanding life itself. In nature, there is no unnecessary complexity. Things exist and function according to their nature. There is growth, change, and decay, but there is no artificial pressure or constant striving for status. By observing nature, a person can begin to see how life operates at a fundamental level. This observation can lead to a clearer understanding of what is necessary and what is not. Nature also provides a kind of balance. It slows the mind down and reduces the constant stimulation that comes from social life. In this state, a person can think more clearly and feel more grounded. Thoreau also emphasizes the importance of independence. He believes that a person should not rely too heavily on society for direction. While cooperation is necessary, dependence can limit freedom. This independence is not about isolation. It is about maintaining the ability to think and act according to one's own understanding. A person should be able to stand apart when necessary, rather than simply following what others do. At the same time, he recognizes that this path is not easy. Society creates strong pressure to conform. People fear being different, being judged, or being left behind. Because of this, many choose to follow the expected path, even if it does not feel right. Thoreau challenges this directly. He argues that living authentically requires courage. A person must be willing to question accepted ideas and make choices that may not be understood by others. This idea becomes central to his philosophy. It is not enough to think differently. A person must also be willing to live differently. As this foundation is established, Thoreau's philosophy begins to expand beyond simplicity and nature. It starts to address deeper questions about society, authority, and the individual's role within a larger system. Because once a person begins to live deliberately and think independently, they cannot avoid another question. What should they do when society itself is built on ideas or systems that they believe are wrong? As Thoreau's philosophy continues, it moves from the simplicity of individual living into a much sharper and more challenging question. What should a person do when the society around them is not just distracting or misguided, but actively unjust? It is one thing to simplify life and think independently, but it is another to live within a system that demands participation in things that go against one's own understanding of right and wrong. This is where Thoreau's thinking becomes more direct and more confrontational. He begins by examining the nature of government. Most people accept government as something necessary and largely unquestionable. It creates laws, maintains order, and organizes society. But Thoreau does not accept this blindly. He asks a simple but important question. Does the existence of a law make it right? His answer is clear. It does not. For him, morality does not come from authority. It comes from individual conscience. A person has the ability to recognize right and wrong, and this recognition should not be overridden simply because a law exists. If a law is unjust, then following it is not a neutral act. It becomes a form of participation in that injustice. This idea leads to one of his most famous positions, the concept of civil disobedience. Thoreau argues that when a government enforces unjust laws, individuals have a responsibility to resist, not necessarily through violence or chaos, but through refusal. Refusal to support, to obey, or to participate in actions that go against their conscience. He puts this idea into practice in his own life. When the government supports policies that he believes are wrong, such as slavery and war, he refuses to pay taxes that would fund those actions. As a result, he is briefly imprisoned. But for Thoreau, this is not a failure. It is a demonstration of his philosophy. He shows that personal integrity is more important than comfort or convenience. A person who follows their conscience, even at a cost, is living more truthfully than someone who complies without question. This idea challenges the usual way people think about responsibility. Many believe that as long as they're not directly causing harm, they're not responsible. But Thoreau argues that passive support also matters. If a person continues to benefit from or support a system that causes harm, they are part of it. This creates a much higher standard for individual action. It is no longer enough to avoid doing wrong personally. A person must also consider the systems they are part of and whether those systems align with their values. At the same time, Thoreau is careful about how resistance should be carried out. He does not support blind rebellion or constant conflict. His approach is based on principle rather than reaction. The goal is not to destroy society, but to refuse participation in what is unjust. This kind of resistance is quiet but powerful. It does not rely on force, but on consistency. A person simply refuses to act against their conscience, regardless of pressure. Over time, this creates a form of moral pressure on society itself. He believes that real change does not come only from large movements or institutions. It begins with individuals who are willing to act according to their own understanding. When enough people refuse to support injustice, the system begins to weaken. This idea connects directly to his earlier emphasis on independence. A person who depends heavily on society for comfort or identity may find it difficult to resist. But someone who has simplified their life and reduced unnecessary needs is in a stronger position. They have less to lose. They are less controlled by fear of consequences. This makes it easier to act according to principle rather than convenience. Thoreau also challenges the idea that majority opinion determines what is right. In many societies, decisions are made based on what most people support. But he argues that truth is not determined by numbers. A majority can be wrong, and often is. Because of this, he places greater importance on the individual conscience than on collective agreement. A single person who understands something clearly has a responsibility to act on that understanding, even if others disagree. This creates a different view of courage. It is not about dramatic action or public recognition. It is about quiet consistency, the ability to hold to one's principles even when it is uncomfortable or unpopular. Another important aspect of his thinking at this stage is the idea of responsibility toward one's own life. While he emphasizes resistance to injustice, he also reminds the individual not to become completely consumed by it. A person must still live, think, and grow. They must not lose themselves entirely in opposition. Balance is necessary. Resistance should come from clarity, not from constant anger or reaction. This reflects a deeper principle in his philosophy. Everything returns to conscious living. Whether simplifying life, observing nature, or resisting injustice, the goal is the same: to act with awareness and intention, rather than habit or pressure. At the same time, Thoreau recognizes that not everyone will follow this path. Many will continue to accept society as it is, either because they agree with it or because they do not question it deeply. But his philosophy is not built around convincing everyone. It is built around the individual. Each person must decide how they will live, what they will accept, and what they will refuse. This creates a strong sense of personal responsibility. A person cannot simply blame society for their actions. They must examine their own choices and the role they play within larger systems. As this part of his philosophy develops, it becomes clear that Thoreau is not only concerned with how to live simply, but how to live rightly. Simplicity creates freedom, and that freedom allows a person to act according to their conscience. The connection between these ideas becomes stronger. Without independence, it is difficult to resist. Without awareness, it is difficult to see injustice. Without courage, it is difficult to act. All of these elements work together, forming a philosophy that is both practical and demanding. It asks the individual not just to think differently, but to live differently, even when it comes at a cost. And as this direction becomes clearer, the next stage of his philosophy begins to explore what it truly means to live fully, not just in opposition to society, but in alignment with one's own nature, where simplicity, independence, and moral clarity come together into a complete way of life. As Thoreau's philosophy deepens, this stage becomes less about ideas and more about the texture of living itself. He is no longer only asking what is true or what is right, but how a human being actually experiences life when they begin to remove distraction, question habits, and pay attention with full awareness. This is where his thinking becomes most subtle, because it deals with something that is easy to overlook yet constantly present: the way a person moves through each moment. He begins by returning again to the idea of living deliberately, but now it expands into something far more demanding than simple awareness. To live deliberately is to refuse unconscious living in every form. It means not allowing days to pass in repetition without noticing them. It means not letting routines shape life without examination. It is an active effort to remain awake within one's own existence. He observes that most people fall into patterns so deeply that they stop seeing them. They wake at the same time, follow the same paths, think the same thoughts, and react in predictable ways. Over time, this creates a kind of invisible structure around their lives. It feels stable, but it also limits perception. The world becomes familiar, and because it is familiar, it is no longer truly seen. Thoreau sees this as one of the quiet losses of human life. Not because routine is inherently wrong, but because unconscious routine reduces awareness. When a person stops noticing, life becomes smaller, even if externally it appears full. To break this pattern, he suggests something simple but powerful. Pay attention as if everything is being seen for the first time. Not artificially, not by forcing wonder, but by genuinely observing what is present. The sound of footsteps, the texture of air, the movement of light across a surface. These details are always there, but they are usually ignored. By noticing them, something changes. The mind becomes more focused, less scattered. Instead of jumping constantly between thoughts, it settles into what is actually happening. This creates a deeper connection to the present moment. He believes that this connection is where real living begins, not in large achievements or dramatic experiences, but in the quality of attention brought to ordinary moments. A person who is fully aware can find depth in simplicity, while a distracted person can move through complexity without truly experiencing it. This idea becomes even more significant when he considers time. Most people experience time as something that moves quickly, often too quickly. Days pass, weeks pass, and there's a sense that life is slipping away. Thoreau does not see this as a problem of time itself, but as a problem of attention. When attention is scattered, time feels compressed. Moments blur together and memory becomes thin. But when attention is focused, time expands. A single moment can feel complete, detailed, and fully lived. This changes the relationship between quantity and quality. Instead of trying to fill life with more experiences, a person can deepen the experiences they already have. This creates a different kind of richness, one that does not depend on constant activity. At the same time, he explores the idea of mental simplicity. Earlier, he spoke about reducing physical needs, but here he turns inward. The mind itself can become crowded with unnecessary thoughts. Worry about the future, regret about the past, comparison with others, and constant evaluation of one's position. These thoughts create noise. They pull attention away from the present and fragment experience. Thoreau suggests that just as a person can simplify their external life, they can also simplify their inner life. This does not mean forcing the mind to be empty. It means becoming aware of what is unnecessary and letting it pass without constant engagement. When a mind is not overloaded, it becomes clearer, calmer, and more capable of real perception. Solitude becomes essential in this process. Thoreau sees solitude not as loneliness, but as a condition where the mind is free from constant influence. In solitude, a person is not required to respond, perform, or adapt to others. This creates space for thought to develop naturally. He spends long periods alone not because he rejects people, but because he values clarity. In solitude, he can observe without interruption, reflect without pressure, and experience without distraction. This allows him to understand himself and the world more deeply. However, he does not present solitude as an escape from life. It is a tool, a way of resetting perception. When a person returns from solitude, they can engage with others more authentically without losing their sense of self. Another important idea that emerges here is the relationship between effort and ease. Many people believe that a meaningful life requires constant effort, struggle, and striving. But Thoreau begins to question this assumption. He observes that in nature, things do not strain unnecessarily. Growth happens, but it follows a natural rhythm. There is effort, but it is not forced. This leads him to consider whether human life could follow a similar pattern. He suggests that much of human effort is misdirected. People struggle not because life itself requires it, but because they pursue unnecessary goals or maintain unnecessary complexity. When life is simplified, much of this effort disappears. This does not mean that life becomes effortless, but that effort becomes more aligned with actual needs rather than artificial ones. Work becomes purposeful rather than excessive. Action becomes intentional rather than reactive. This idea creates a different relationship with productivity. Instead of measuring life by how much is done, it is measured by how meaningfully it is done. A small amount of focused, deliberate action can be more valuable than constant activity without awareness. He also reflects on the idea of independence at a deeper level. Earlier, independence was about resisting society and thinking for oneself. Now it becomes internal. A person must not only be independent from external pressure, but also from internal habits that limit awareness. Fear, for example, can shape behavior just as strongly as social expectation. Fear of missing out, fear of failure, fear of being different. These internal forces can control a person even when external pressure is reduced. Thoreau suggests that true independence requires noticing these internal influences and not being controlled by them. This creates a more stable form of freedom, one that is not easily disturbed by changing conditions. As this stage develops, his philosophy becomes quieter but also more precise. It is no longer focused on large changes or dramatic actions. It is focused on how a person experiences each moment, how they think, how they perceive, and how they respond. Everything begins to come back to awareness, not as an abstract idea, but as a practical way of living. To notice more, to react less automatically, to question more deeply, and to live with intention rather than habit. In this way, Thoreau builds a vision of life that is not defined by external success or constant activity, but by depth, clarity, and presence. A life where even the simplest moment can carry meaning, not because it is extraordinary, but because it is fully experienced. And as this perspective settles in, the final stage of his philosophy begins to gather all of these ideas together, moving toward a complete understanding of what it truly means to live a life that is simple, aware, independent, and fully aligned with one's own nature. As Thoreau's philosophy reaches its final stage, everything he has been building begins to settle into a single, unified way of living. Simplicity, independence, awareness, and moral clarity are no longer separate ideas. They become parts of one continuous approach to existence, where each moment is lived with intention rather than habit. At this point, the question is no longer how to escape society, reduce possessions, or resist injustice in isolation. The deeper question becomes how to live fully, every day, in a way that reflects clear understanding. Not occasionally, not during special moments, but as a constant state of being. He returns once again to the idea of deliberate living, but now it carries its fullest meaning. To live deliberately is to be present in every action, to know why something is being done, and to ensure that it aligns with one's understanding. It is the refusal to drift through life unconsciously. This kind of living removes a great deal of confusion. Many people feel lost not because life is unclear, but because their actions are disconnected from their understanding. They follow routines they never chose, pursue goals they never examined, and measure themselves by standards they never questioned. Thoreau cuts through this by insisting on alignment. Thought, action, and experience must move together. When a person understands something, they should attempt to live according to it. When they act, they should be aware of why they are acting. This creates a kind of internal consistency that brings clarity. At the same time, he makes it clear that this is not about perfection. A person will not always succeed in living exactly as they understand. There will be mistakes, distractions, and moments of inconsistency. But what matters is the direction, the continuous effort to return to awareness and alignment. This removes the pressure of achieving a perfect life. Instead, life becomes a process of correction and refinement. A person notices when they drift into habit or distraction, and they bring themselves back to deliberate living. Another key idea in this final stage is the redefinition of success. Throughout his philosophy, Thoreau has been quietly challenging the common idea that success is measured by wealth, status, or recognition. Now he replaces it with something much simpler and more demanding. Success is the ability to live according to one's own understanding. This definition changes everything. It is not dependent on external conditions. A person can be considered successful even if they have very little, as long as they're living in alignment with their values. At the same time, a person can have everything society offers and still be unsuccessful if they are not living authentically. This idea removes comparison. There is no need to measure one's life against others, because each person has their own understanding and their own path. What matters is not how one life looks from the outside, but how it is lived from within. He also brings together his ideas about nature in a final way. Nature is no longer just a place of retreat or observation. It becomes a model for living. In nature, Everything follows its own pattern without unnecessary excess. There is movement, growth, and change, but there is no artificial pressure. By observing this, a person can begin to align their own life in a similar way, not by copying nature directly, but by understanding its principles. Simplicity, balance, and natural rhythm. This leads to a quieter and more stable form of living, one that is not constantly pushed by desire or fear, but guided by awareness and necessity. At the same time, Thoreau returns to the idea of moral clarity. Living deliberately is not only about personal experience. It also includes how a person acts in relation to others and society. A clear life must also be an honest one. If something is understood to be wrong, it should not be supported. If something is understood to be right, it should be followed. This does not require dramatic action, but it does require consistency. A person who lives in alignment with their conscience creates a kind of integrity that cannot be taken away by external circumstances. This integrity becomes a stable foundation, something that does not depend on success or failure. He also addresses the idea of time in a final way. Many people feel that life is short and that they are running out of time. Thoreau does not deny that life has limits, but he changes the way time is experienced. When a person lives deliberately, time no longer feels wasted. Each moment is used fully, not because it is filled with activity, but because it is experienced with awareness. Even simple moments become complete. This creates a sense of sufficiency. Life does not need to be expanded endlessly, because what is already present is enough when it is fully lived. As everything comes together, Thoreau's philosophy presents a clear and grounded conclusion. A good life is not complicated. It does not require constant accumulation, endless striving, or external validation. It requires clarity. Clarity about what is necessary, what is true, and what matters. From that clarity comes simplicity. From simplicity comes freedom. From freedom comes the ability to live according to one's own understanding. This way of living is not dramatic. It is quiet, steady, and consistent. It happens in small choices, repeated over time. Choosing to pay attention, choosing to question, choosing to act with intention. In the end, Thoreau does not offer a system to follow or a final goal to reach. He offers a way of seeing and a way of living, one that removes what is unnecessary and brings forward what is essential. A life where nothing is done blindly, where each moment is experienced fully, and where the individual remains connected to their own understanding without being lost in the noise of society. And within that life, there's a kind of quiet completeness, not because everything has been achieved, but because nothing important has been ignored.